Hello, chess fans. Today we are going to look at a game between Max Euwe, world champion Max Euwe, and Paul Keres. These are two players that I love, and I really love this particular game, which features a queen sacrifice and a lot of dynamism. I also love the history to this game and the context to this game. If you are also interested in that, check out the blog that I'll link in the show notes for more information about the game and for more detailed annotations on the game. To dive into the game now, the game was an ninth game, and a match from 1940. The match was tied 4-4 before this game, so the game was very critical in the match that Keres eventually won. Euwe began the game with pawn to d4, and we're going to kind of skip through the opening a little bit. After the early opening phase, we get a Queen's Indian defense with natural play by both players. And it's only here that we get kind of a new move in a position that was played hundreds or thousands of times. Pawn to d6 is a little less usual than pawn c5 or pawn f5, but in general the position is very flexible and playable for black and for white. Euwe plays this quieter move queen c2, and after pawn f5 to stop e4, he plays knight to e1 with a couple of ideas. One idea is to exchange bishops because black's bishop on b7 is a little stronger than the bishop on g2 that was stifled by the knight. And obviously another idea is to secure more control over e4 and to play e4. Now, Keres plays queen c8, which might not be the best move, but it's interesting and retains the tension. And pawn e4 from Euwe is met by knight d7, another move that maintains the tension. There's quite a lot of interesting play with tension between the pawns in the center of the board in this game. So after knight d7, this is a good point to pause and try and figure out what you would have played here as white. Well, I think it's possible that you could have improved on Euwe's play. I believe that the best move here is e takes f5. And the main thing to note here is that no matter which way black trades, or whether or not black exchanges on g2 first, in all of the resulting positions, I believe that white has a significant advantage because the e6 pawn or the e6 square and the light squares around it are ending up fairly weak. I think it's pretty clear that the pawn structure ends up pretty favorable for white, so I find it odd that Keres would allow this. And I find it odd that Euwe would not go for this. As a world champion and a tremendous player, it seems extremely natural for me to choose this, and I can only think that he made an odd misevaluation or miscalculation in the alternative positions. Jumping back, after knight d7, what Euwe did play was the move pawn to d5. And this is interesting, but after natural play by Keres, I think really black is the one pressing. So after pawn d5, he simply exchanges on e4, and we have a decision about how to capture back on e4. Bishop takes e4 is kind of obvious, but it's also kind of obvious that after the natural knight f6, everything is defended, and also the bishop and the pawn on d5 are under pressure. Now, I think this is kind of where you can stop calculating and be like, all right, this isn't really what white wants, but bishop g5 is an interesting line, and I want to give you a line from Stockfish right here. This is obviously trying to put pressure on the knight, but black has a very nice line to secure an advantage. After knight takes, bishop takes e7, rook to f7, queen takes e4. The obvious move, rook takes e7, is quite fine for black, and the position's probably about equal, but black has a better move that secures a large advantage. After pawn takes d5, you can't really capture back because then queen c8 pins and wins the bishop and secures black a large advantage. If you don't capture on d5 and you try to move your queen and defend the bishop, then in this position h6 traps the bishop. It has no way to escape, and when black regains the bishop, black will always have a sizable advantage. Really a very nice line from Stockfish. Jumping back, Euwe decided on queen takes e4, and now knight c5, which is very natural, and this also highlights one of the weaknesses of pushing the pawn to d5. We just gave black the c5 square. White plays queen e2, bishop f6, bishop h3, putting serious pressure on the e6 pawn and square. Rook e8, bishop e3, white now has a big threat in this position. White's threat is to play bishop takes c5 and bishop takes e6 check, winning a pawn and securing a tremendous position. This is another good point to pause the video and find the correct move and plan from black. Keres did find it, and really it's the only correct move and plan. Otherwise, white would have secured a huge advantage in this position. Keres now unpins with queen d8, and after bishop takes c5, he does not recapture when white would capture on e6 with a large advantage. Instead, he has the intermediate move capturing on d5, kind of reminiscent of the stockfish line we were just looking at. And now the bishop is on prise, of course, and the queen on e2 is on prise. In this position, what Euwe should have done was cut his losses. In this position, he can give his piece back by bishop e3, pawn d4, pinning the piece, and then the best way to give it back is bishop g2. Now, black can probably maintain a little pressure, but the best, what white is hoping for at least, is exchanging on g2, winning the piece back. And in this position, things are pretty equal. Maybe black is slightly preferable. I mean, bishop versus knight, that kind of thing. But it's pretty equal. White really has no significant cause for complaint in this position. Instead, after the capture on d5, Euwe plays bishop e6 check. And I think the thing that comes to mind is the phrase Patzer sees check, Patzer gives check. Now, Euwe is by no means a Patzer, but it's still tempting when you're in a position that feels kind of difficult and you're struggling to calculate. You're tempted to make a forcing move. You're tempted to give a check like this because you have the illusion of control for a moment. But in the resulting position, this bishop is suddenly, precariously placed, and white's not going to be able to keep the bishop advantage. So black is now going to regain the piece and have a large advantage. This bishop e6 check is a very instructive mistake. Now, black simply steps away with the king h8, and you can't retreat the bishop. I mean, you can, but you'll just lose the bishop on e6 instead. And again, black has a large advantage. This thing ends up pinned and won very, very quickly. Black's going to have the bishop pair, maybe an extra pawn even. It's really bad. So Euwe tries the move rook to d1, and of course now it's time to capture on c5. And Euwe could have captured here on d5, but black has many good choices. Bishop takes d5 is fine. Bishop d4, also strong. And even bishop takes b2 with the idea of queen takes e2, rook takes e6 is also good. I'll show that line on the board. Queen takes, rook takes, with a pin right here and a winning position for black. Jumping back, Euwe decides that he's going to try to secure this strong post on e6 and accept his losses and just try to get some counterplay based on holding onto that pawn on that bishop on e6 and that square, and kind of establishing that as a bone in black's throat. It's a plan that has probably quite a few flaws, but there is no good solution here for white anymore. Knight g2 happens, pawn d4, establishing an extra and passed pawn on d4, also freeing this bishop, and now pawn f4 from white. White is going for pawn to f5 and knight to f4, when I still think even in that most optimistic scenario that black would be pretty much winning, but there's some counterplay and things are not easy for white. For black, I mean. However, at this point, Keres found and executed an excellent and winning sequence. I encourage you to pause your video and try and figure out what Keres played. So, I'm assuming that we all found the excellent sequence found by Keres. He plays the move pawn to d3. This is a distraction tactic and a queen sacrifice as well, because after rook takes d3, we're going in for queen takes d3. Now, white really has no choice but to accept the sacrificed queen with queen takes d3, but then we have bishop to d4 check, an important intermediate move. And really, there's only a couple of choices here for white, right? Now, rook f2 is played. I'll mention that king h1 is a disaster for white, unfortunately, because of rook takes e6, and an unstoppable threat of rook a to e8 and rook to e2. The pin on the knight on g2 is just crushing. White has no way to untangle, and white is going to lose significant amounts of material very, very quickly. You can play it out if you want and try and find a way to untangle, but like I say, there's objectively no way. Really, ideas for white are completely lacking. So Euwe makes the better move, rook to f2, walking into the pin on the rook instead of the pin on the knight. At least he can get out of the pin on the rook. Rook takes e6 from Keres. And this is another good point to pause the video and kind of take stock. Now, in this position, for the queen, Keres has a bishop and a rook. And the math would say that's not enough. But the math is not what's important in chess. What's important is activity and dynamism of pieces. And black's bishops in this position, and also black's rooks, are far, far better than the opposing pieces from white. Now, sometimes when we sacrifice, we think that, for the return, for the sacrifice, we're getting some tactical threats. And, if we don't execute on those threats, then our compensation will slip away and we'll no longer have enough. That's kind of not the case here. In this case, and in many cases of positional sacrifices, the counterplay that you retain and the activity and dynamism that you get for the pieces you sacrificed is a long-term advantage. In this case, white's pieces have no obvious means of activating and improving themselves. Black's pieces are so dominant in this position, and they will remain dominant because of the structure of the position, the way that they're placed, the way that black controls the lines and diagonals. You shouldn't think of this as a short-term compensation for the sacrificed queen. You should think that in this position, black's pieces are simply stronger than the queen. They have every right to be so based on the kind of structure of the position, and white has no way, even with several moves without facing direct threats, to change the nature of the position and to contest black's control of these open files. So getting back to the game, white unpins with king f1. Now, it is perfectly good to capture here on f2, but I think it's better not to capture on f2. This bishop is better than the rook that it could capture here on f2, and instead black simply plays rook a e8, a wonderful move. The control of the e file is so powerful for black here. Note that it's not technically the only open file. The d file is open, but the outpost for the bishop on b4 means that it's effectively closed to use from white's pieces. So after rook a to e8, pawn f5 is a bid from Keres for counterplay. The rook steps away from the attack. Pawn f6. Pawn captures f6. And black's king position has been opened a little bit, but white really can't take advantage of it. And if rook takes f6, rook e2 is one refutation. Then the knight on g2 and the rook on f6 are en prise, and white is losing material. Instead, after f6, pawn takes, the rook tries to run away to d2, and we have another great time to pause the video and try to figure out what Keres played in this position. Keres played the very, very instructive bishop c8. I really, really like this move. This is the strongest move according to Stockfish, and it's a move that I think many of us may not have even considered. The bishop is so attractive here on this diagonal, and it really is powerful in that diagonal, that it's hard to even consider moving it to another diagonal, and especially to move it to another diagonal with a retreating move. The thing is that the bishop didn't really do anything on this diagonal. There were no concrete threats. Meanwhile, recirculating this bishop, particularly to the h3 square, does create tremendous concrete threats, and white, in fact, has no way to defend against these threats. You should never be closed off to an opportunity from a new direction in chess just because you've got good pressure from one other direction. So after bishop c8, the knight moves. The rook comes to e3, kicking the queen around. The queen steps back to b1, rook to f3 check, king g2. And what should black play in this position? Now, it might actually seem like Keres has overplayed his hand a little bit. Suddenly, this rook is hanging. White's pieces actually kind of make sense. For the first time in a long time, they have access to decent squares and diagonals and files. They look much better than they did 5 moves ago anyway. And also the natural move bishop b7 doubling back again is not so good because of knight d5, and suddenly white's back in the game. You got a whole new contest right here. However, black has a forced win in this position, which of course Keres saw before he went in for this position. Rook takes f4, a rook sacrifice that just wins on the spot and in beautiful fashion. Really a great finish to a very wonderful game. Now, of course, the rook has to be captured, but then rook to g8 check, and white has no good king moves. The worst king move he can pick is king h1, when bishop to b7 check mates in only a couple of moves. In fact, it mates in one move, because if the queen blocks, then you have rook g1 mate, and if the rook blocks, you have bishop takes g2 mate. So even when you block, it's mate next move. Instead, king f1 could have been tried, but then you have rook g1 check, and the white queen falls when black is obviously up a tremendous amount of material. And if king f3, as played in the game, bishop g4 check forced Euwe's resignation right here. The reason that Euwe resigned is that if the king goes to the g file, either square, bishop f5 is a discovery that wins the queen. And if the king runs to the e file, we have a beautiful finish. Rook to e8 check, and we can either see king to d5, bishop to f3 check, and mate, or my personal favorite possible finish, king to d3, and bishop i5, check, and mate. I don't even know why I drew the line extending to b1, because we've just checkmated the king. We're not going to capture the queen on the next turn. The skewer is irrelevant. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If you did, you might be interested in some of the other videos that I'll link regarding other games from Keres and also some games from Anatoly Karpov. If you liked the video, consider sharing it with a friend and also leaving a comment on the video. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in another future video about Paul Keres' games.